everybody, how you doing? It's me again, Truth Teacher, coming at you with another video, and today we will be exploring the issue of white Jesus. Now, if you've been following the media this past week, you'll see that this situation has caused a lot of controversy because this activist called Sean King made a statement that depictions of white Jesus are a form of white supremacy and that Jesus himself was not a white man and therefore we shouldn't be depicting him that way. So, let's look at this question. But before we even delve into this whole question about, Christianity being a form of white supremacy, etc., we have to do a little bit of analysis of Christianity itself. And now, listen, I know that there are a lot of people out there who are Christians, and if you are, I'm not in any way trying to slander your religious beliefs or your faith, but I'm simply going to ask you to look at things from a different perspective. The fact of the matter is that Jesus did not intend to create a new religion. If you read the New Testament very carefully, you'll see that this is a fact. Jesus never intended to create a new religion. He did not start Christianity. Jesus was an observant Jew, and his intention was to reform Judaism, which at that time he and many people like him thought that the official body of Judaism in the form of the priesthood had really strayed away from the intentions of Judaism and the law and the purpose of the law. From their perspective, the laws that were given by God were meant to enhance and better the lives of the Jewish people. But because of getting caught up in tradition, the priesthood had actually taken these laws and made them something that was oppressive to the lives of the people. And so in the New Testament, you see several instances where Jesus violates the law because he's saying that you guys have forgotten what the intention was. You're taking it out of context and you're making things more difficult than they have to be. And so he was really all about reforming the church. Much in the same way that in Christianity, later on in the Middle Ages, Martin Luther had set out to reform the Catholic Church. It wasn't his intention of splitting away from the Catholic Church and creating a new sect. Well, same thing with Jesus and his followers. They had no intention of starting a new religion. However, that is what eventually happened. Now, it's important to mention that none of Jesus's followers had anything to do with the creation of Christianity. That was really down to the work of a Jewish theologian called Paul, who we might add was someone who converted to this sect of Christianity at that time, years after Jesus's crucifixion and, as Christians believe, his resurrection. So by the time Paul came along, Jesus had already been crucified and resurrected, going on. He never actually met Jesus in person and had very limited contact with Jesus' apostles. And if you read the New Testament carefully, you'll see that there's a lot of tension between Paul and the apostles in Jerusalem. And so Paul is really the one that's responsible for most of what we consider to be Christianity. Now, at that time, there were a lot of Romans who were converting to Judaism. It was a period of time like now when there were a lot of people who were looking for greater meaning in life. And one of the religions that they were turning to in large numbers was Judaism. However, there were certain things about Judaism that they had problems with. One of them were the dietary laws, and the other was the tradition of circumcision. And Paul was the one that came along and made the stipulation that non-Jews did not have to follow the dietary laws, nor did they have to be circumcised in order to follow Judaism. So from that point on, we begin to see a split between the two groups, and eventually they grow apart. At some point, this new religion, Christianity, begins to be the dominant religion in the Roman Empire. And eventually it becomes the official religion of the empire with the coming of Constantine. Now, when we look at this early church, we notice that there's a lot of things that are very different than Judaism. And one of the major differences that we see is this tradition of having religious icons, religious images. Because in Judaism, it was expressly forbidden to make any kind of depictions of living creatures, whether they be, animals in the air, on the land, in the sea, or human beings. That was a big no-no. But in the Greco-Roman world, this was a part of their religious practice. And the Romans, now that they had made it the official religion of the empire, were trying to make things more palatable for the population. So one of the things they did was they started to incorporate traditions and practices from the old polytheistic religions into the church. And so this is when we start having depictions of the prophets and of Jesus himself. So what they did, when we look at the depictions, the earliest depictions that we have of Jesus, what we see is that they took depictions of Zeus, or if you're Roman, Jupiter, and they kind of just like slapped Jesus's name on it, so that people would be comfortable with having something that they could look at and venerate. And so the first images that we have of Jesus are really recycled images of Zeus and Jupiter and other deities from the Greco-Roman pantheon. Now, fast forward to the end of the Roman Empire, right? The Roman Empire had split in two. You had the Byzantine Church, you had the Byzantine Empire in the east. That was the eastern half of the Roman Empire. And then you had the western half, which had its capital still in Rome. But eventually, the western half of the Roman Empire fell apart. And at that point, it had brought most of Europe under its authority, but now the Roman Empire was gone, and so Europe enters its Middle Ages, but they're still Christians. And they still have the tradition of creating images. Now, we have to keep in mind that at this time in the world, people did not travel the way we do today. People didn't have maps, people didn't have magazines, they didn't have pictures, they didn't have any kind of visual media whatsoever. Most people never traveled beyond the villages or towns where they were born and raised. They were born there, they lived there, they died there. So if you're going to be making images of people, these people from the Bible, well, you're going to use as your model. You're going to use the people who you see around you, because you ain't never been nowhere. You ain't never seen nobody different. So all you know is the people that are around you. So you're European. By default, if you're making a depiction of Jesus, you're going to get a model, and that model is going to be a European from your town. So by default, you're going to have a white Jesus, which by default you had a white Jesus from the very beginning, because, the Romans took their old Jupiter, their old Zeus, and they made him Jesus. So that's the birth of white Jesus. Now, did they have intentions at this time of oppressing black people, making white supremacy? And the answer to that is no, because black people, or more correctly, Africans, really weren't on their radar like that. There was really minimal interaction with Africa. Of course, a large part of the empire was in North Africa and Egypt, but in terms of sub-Saharan Africa, they really didn't have that much interaction with them. Certainly not creating an economy that was based on African slavery. There was slavery in the Roman Empire, but that was one of the few areas in Roman life where there was equality, like everybody could be a slave, regardless of your color, So you could be a slave, you could be a slave, you could be a slave. Everybody can be a slave, It is what it is, or it was what it was, So originally, all of these works of art that we see in Europe were not created with the intention of oppressing anyone except for their own lower classes. But that begins to change once we enter the age of exploration and colonialism and slavery. So the thing you need to understand about white supremacy, or one of the things you need to understand about it, is that these people, they were making this shit up as they went along. They did not have a well thought out, bona fide ideology of white supremacy. This is something that was really born out of a need. And the need that they had once they came over here to the Western Hemisphere and they started establishing colonies that were dependent on slave labor is, how do we keep this workforce in line? We can chain them, we can use military force, but that's very costly, very time consuming. The best way to do this is to get these people to agree, to get into these people's minds and emotionally condition them. So as the centuries progress, we see this first thing they do is, they baptize, or they force these people to convert to Christianity. And this is something that they were actually doing back in Europe also, because while most of Western Europe was converted to Christianity, there actually was a long period of time when there were actually crusades in different parts of Europe, the eastern parts and the northern parts, forcing people to convert to Christianity. And of course, we all know the story of Queen Isabella in Spain and what happened with the Muslims and the Jews. So there was already this push, this mentality that people who were not Christians had to be forcibly converted, or, exiled, or put to death, or invited to a barbecue where they were the first thing on the menu. So of course, when they bring the Africans over, they already have this mindset of forced conversion, and of course, they did the same thing to the Native Americans as well. And so, as the mechanisms of class distinction are being solidified, one of the tools that they're going to use on the people who they subjugate is going to be religion. And so they have to equate themselves now with God, with the divine. And one of the ways that they do this is, hey, well, what do we got here? Well, hey, what do you know? We have all these images of Jesus and God and the prophets, and they just all happen to be white. So therefore, being white is being closer to God. So it's a method of brainwashing. But the ironic thing here is that there was also a similar brainwashing that happened to people back in Europe, because even though everybody back in Europe was the same skin color, they couldn't use white Jesus that way, right? But what they did do is they did make the aristocracy equivalent with, how do I say this? With the divine, right? To be an aristocrat meant that you were closer to God. One of the methods of brainwashing that they used in Europe against European people, the common people, was when they made these depictions of Jesus and the saints and the prophets, they would use for their models a lot of times people from the aristocracy. So for example, in Italy, the ruling classes, like the Medicis, they would actually take people who were the ruling members, the patriarchs of these elite families, and they would depict them as Jesus or, other holy figures. And so that was done to impress upon the ordinary people that, you have to obey the king, you have to obey the leaders, the rulers, because they were appointed by God. They called it the divine right, so that, people would ask, well, why is it that we have to suffer in poverty and you guys get to live in the lap of luxury? And they say, well, it was divine right. It was ordained by God. We are God's chosen, and we're placed here to be, the elite, to be the rulers. And if you are to obey God, you have to obey us.
It's good to be the king.
So right here we're seeing, yes, white Jesus was a product. It became a tool of mental conditioning that was used by the elite slave-owning colonialist class. But if we take it a step further, all we see is that all they did was they repurposed something that they had already began in Europe. They had already begun in Europe a process of brainwashing by equating themselves with the divine. They just expanded it. They just expanded on it, and they made, not only is it divine to be, an aristocrat, but to be white is also divine. You're closer to divinity if you're white. At its heart, white supremacy in and of itself is just one of many tools that was created by the ruling elite to maintain their class system. Was white Jesus originally a product of white supremacy? No, white Jesus did not originally start out as a racist, but he kind of got jumped in to the gang as time went along, because they needed him. Now, the issue of whether or not Jesus was white, once again, that's one of those tricky questions, because we got to ask ourselves, how are we defining white? What the hell does that mean anyway? And once again, we see that these people just make this shit up as they go along. If we go to Palestine itself, we'll see the people there are not white like Europeans. They certainly were not blonde-haired and blue-eyed. But if we were really being true to the spirit of the Bible itself, we wouldn't be creating religious images in the first place. So there wouldn't be any issue of a white Jesus, a black Jesus, a mulatto Jesus, Chinese Jesus. It's all moot, because according to the Bible, the Old Testament, or the Torah, if you're a Jew, we're not supposed to be making depictions of human beings anyway. So, everybody, that is the answer in a nutshell about white Jesus. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. Leave your comments down below, as long as you're respectful. If you really hated this video and you hated everything that I had to say, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up, like it, leave a nice comment down below, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so that you can be notified when I make new videos, and I will see you next time. Love and light, peace and prosperity and perfect health to everyone, and good night.